Live.
Good morning, everyone. Those of you who I haven't yet met, I'm Alice Tipping and I lead the work at the IASD on the Fisheries Subsidies negotiations. Many of you will be very familiar with these negotiations already, but this webinar is one of two that we're running. We're running one this morning and one tomorrow. And this particular webinar, which will take, I hope, around an hour and a half, is essentially designed to provide a sort of an update on the state of play. Forgive me, I have a cold. An update on the state of play of where the negotiations are at, taking into account the chair's text that was released just before the Christmas break on about the 18th of December last year. And it is essentially designed to help particularly new delegates, people who are new to the issue, but also those of you who know it very well, to get an overall sense of where we're at. So a couple of sort of Zoom housekeeping points. Many of you will be more than used to Zoom calls by now, but two quick requests. We would ask that you keep yourselves on mute, please, unless and until you take the floor, and I hope you will later on. And I would also ask, please, that you not record the session yourselves. We will be recording it, so you'll see the little cloud with the red dot. We will record it, and we will record my parts of the presentation, but we will not be recording the discussion amongst us. That's out of respect for everyone's privacy, but also to ensure that if you would like to contribute, you feel as free to do so as possible. We will also be making our own video of the event available on our website. So you needn't feel that you need to keep a video recording of it all. You will have the slides and you will have the video of my presentation available to you afterwards. And as I see people joining us, hello, welcome. You are in the right place if you're looking for the webinar on fisheries subsidies and the WTO negotiations. So perhaps just a sort of a very quick overview of what we're going to cover. I'm going to talk briefly about a few points of context. Many of you who know the negotiations will be familiar with these, but perhaps for those of you who are a bit newer, a couple of points of context that for us are important to understand why we're engaged in these negotiations and why the problem that the negotiations are trying to fix is in fact quite urgent. I'm then going to move through essentially following more or less the structure of the chair's draft consolidated text. We're going to talk a bit about the scope and the definitions that are currently in the text. We're going to talk about the three substantive pillars of rules. So the rule on prohibiting subsidies to vessels or operators engaged in IUU fishing, prohibiting subsidies to fishing of overfished stocks under some circumstances, and the third substantive pillar, which is prohibiting subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. And then I'll cover at the end some of the legal and institutional issues that have also come up in discussions recently. That is a lot of content to cover, I know. So what I would like to do is to cover perhaps context, the scope and definitions, and the IUU section. And then perhaps the overfished stock section, and then I will pause and we'll have a moment, sort of some time for discussion and questions and answers, because that's probably more than enough content to start with. A couple of points. If, as you go through, you have questions that you'd like to put in the chat, please do. Because there's such a lot to cover, you might want to record the questions there quickly and we can come back to them when we pause in the middle for the discussion. Otherwise, when we get to the discussion phase, you will be very welcome to take the floor. I'll keep an eye on the raised hands. Many of you will be familiar with that, but also feel free to put questions into the chat if you feel more comfortable doing that. With that, forgive me, my cold. With that, perhaps, and welcome to those of you who are just joining us. We've just covered a few housekeeping points. Keeping yourselves on mute, please not record. And with that, perhaps I will move into some of the content because I'm conscious that we don't have that much time and I do want to leave some time for questions and answers. So welcome if you've just joined us and we're just getting started. So perhaps to start with a few words of context. Now, this is a graph that of course is going to be very familiar to many of you who are following the negotiations, but I think it's an important place to start. So this graph is essentially the UN Food and Agriculture Organization's kind of signature visual, which illustrates the state of marine fish stocks as best they can estimate it. So it covers stocks that have formal assessments and some others for which the FAO produces their own assessments. And essentially, there's probably a couple of key messages to take away. It's clear really from this graph that in the last 40 years, the proportion of stocks that are fished at sustainable levels, that's everything in blue, has gradually but inexorably, I would say, decreased. And the proportion that is overfished has inexorably increased. Now, when our negotiation started in 2001, around 25% or so of stocks were considered to be overfished. As of 2017, that's looking like more like 34%. So while the negotiations are taking a long time, the problem isn't actually getting any better. Arguably, it's getting worse. So while an increased number of fisheries are fished at their maximum sustainable limit, that's the blue part above the white line, that is considered sustainably fished. So that's a good thing. But what's also clear is that the proportion of fisheries that are underfished, for which there is some room for expansion, has also, in fact, quite dramatically decreased. And now it's only around 9% of global stocks with assessments. So those are two important messages, I think, to take away from this particular chart. And when you look at fishing capacity, we're going to talk, in fact, with the author of this paper in much more detail about this tomorrow. But this I thought was an interesting sort of snapshot graph, because essentially it shows us a couple of different things about how global fishing capacity has increased. This is over a slightly longer time period, from 1950 all the way through to 2015. So we're talking the second half of the 20th century. And the bars on the left essentially show the number of fishing vessels in the world, as Yannick Rousseau has estimated. So in 1950, we probably had somewhere between high 60s, about 70 million vessels, mainly unpowered. But we see that through 1980 and up to 2015, we saw a huge growth in the number of vessels to almost 150 or so million, and a major shift from unpowered to powered artisanal vessels. And this is using countries' own definitions, more or less, as well as a growth in the number of industrial vessels. So we've seen a huge expansion in the global fleet. But of course, it's not just the number of vessels that matters, it's also how powerful they are. And that's what the bars on the right-hand side show us. So the bars on the right essentially show how this increase translates in terms of the increase of engine power of the global fleet. And so it shows us, I think, that the 10 million or so industrial vessels of the fleet have about half the fleet's total engine power, simply because they are so large. So that's a way of illustrating how the composition of the global fleet has changed. And you can start to see some of the trends come together. Again, we're going to do a lot more on catch per unit of effort tomorrow morning, but this is just kind of a snapshot, again, from the Rousseau research, which begins to show us the relationship between all that effort that we saw in the bar charts and actual catch rates. And overall, the picture is quite clear. There are differences, but the picture overall shows us essentially that for most fishing fleets, these fishing fleets are actually catching far less per unit of effort expended than they did, say, in the middle of last century. So, it seems like, it's based on this data, they're catching, in some cases, less than a fifth of what they did back in 1950 for the same unit of effort. And that's taking into account the fact that technology is advancing. So again, there are variations, but the economics of the fleet and also the relationship between the effort expended and the actual resource and what is caught is clearly moving in one direction. Now getting perhaps to fisheries subsidies. Again, many of you will know this very well already, but perhaps as a summary for those of you who are new, we have essentially three main sources of information about the subsidies that countries provide to fishing. We have WTO notifications, of course. They're imperfect. Not everybody provides a notification, and not all notifications are complete in themselves. So some notifications will list the subsidy provided, but not the amount, for example. So that's the very formal source of information. There's also work done by Rashid Soumaila and others at the University of British Columbia who provide an estimate of the total number of fishery subsidies based on their own methods. And they estimate that to be at around $35 billion in 2018, of which some $22 billion per year is provided in forms of subsidies that enhance fishing capacity. So that's kind of the academic estimate based on what not sort of unofficial sources, but also modeling what they suspect is there. I suppose sort of in between those two levels, the OECD has its own calculation. So they include notifications from countries, and they include not just subsidies, but a broader concept of fisheries support. And so they, based on their figures of including notifications and also their own estimates, including of non-OECD members, they estimate that around $9 billion of support is provided to the fishing sector per year, and that's covering 39 economies. So we have imperfect information about exactly what fisheries subsidies are provided, but we have estimates. We have some sources of information that can give us part of the picture. An important point, though, is that not all subsidies have the same impact. And this is a graph that I find quite useful. I apologize that it's complicated, but it's worth thinking through, also because it provides some background to why the negotiations are structured the way they are, and in particular why the overcapacity and overfishing pillar of the negotiations is structured the way it is. So the graph on the right essentially shows the degree of impact of different kinds of financial support on specific measures of fishing effort. That's the things along the bottom, either fishing effort, fishing capacity, fishers' income, or the fish stocks. If, and this is an important caveat, if there are no effective restrictions on effort or catch in that fishery, if it's what is called an open access fishery. And that is in fact the reality for the vast majority of global fisheries. So it's a good basis to start work from, I think. So I'm going to highlight just 3 points that I think are relevant background to understanding some of the proposals on the table. First, if you look at the effort column, that's the one on the left, we see that support to variable inputs of fishing, that's the cost of bait or the cost of gear or the cost of fuel, has a very strong impact on the level of fishing effort. Subsidies to fuel, in particular, have a very strong impact on how much fishers will fish. Now, the concept of overfishing means that too much effort is being provided into a fishery. So subsidies to variable inputs or operating costs are, from a theoretical perspective at least, those that are most likely to contribute to overfishing. If you jump over to the stock column, you can see that this funding also makes the funding that makes the most difference to effort also has the biggest impact on the stock, which stands to reason. The more you overfish, the more likely you are to have an impact on the stock, on the resource itself. If we move to the capacity column, so that's the second one over from effort, the modelling by the OECD essentially shows us that funds provided to the capital costs, so to fishing vessels, for example, have a particularly strong impact on fishing capacity, and this is what you would expect. So support provided to operating costs doesn't have quite the same impact. And again, the level of overcapacity, so this is a concept you'll hear in the mandate, the level of overcapacity means there's too much fishing capacity. Vessels are too large, or the technology would enable them to fish, if it was fully used, more than the resource could support sustainably. So subsidies to capital costs of fishing vessels, new boats, new engines, new technology are those that are most likely to contribute to overcapacity. Now, to underline a very important caveat, this modelling assumes there are no effective controls in place on fishing effort or the quantities of catch. And this is still the case for the majority of fisheries around the world. If you had very strictly enforced fishing rules, that might limit the impact of subsidies on fishing effort and stocks, at least for a while. But there are very few fisheries in the world where this is the case. And the logic here, the logic or this sort of modelling is the reason why several proposals on the table for rules on subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing focus on prohibiting operating costs and capital costs. So these are the subsidies we think are most likely to contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. And the caveat that I mentioned above is also the reason why some proposals, and in fact the chair's text, suggest that these subsidies might be allowed to continue if effective fisheries management is in place. And the key word there being effective. And the very last point on this slide is illustrated, I think, in the income column in the middle. And it's just to point out that support provided in the form of variable cost, and in particular support that reduces the price of fuel, likely provides very little actual support to fishers' incomes. According to the OECD's modelling, much of the value of that support can actually end up benefiting the providers of those inputs, so the people who sell fishermen bait or fuel, rather than the fishers themselves. So this I think is a useful. It was useful to spend some time on this because I think it's an important part of context that helps us to understand, in particular, the last pillar of the negotiations. So, moving precisely into the negotiations, we're going to start by talking about the scope and the definitions that are currently on the table and currently reflected in the Chair's draft consolidated text. So essentially this new agreement would apply to the same kinds of government expenditure that currently meet the definition of subsidies under Article 1 of the WTO's Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. So the kinds of measures covered by that agreement currently are the kinds of measures that would be covered by these rules. The second element is that these negotiations are focused very much on marine wild capture fishing and fishing related activities at sea. So this means, very importantly, that subsidies to aquaculture and subsidies to inland fishing are not within the scope of the agreement. And in fact, there's now a footnote in the text to clarify that precisely. The second point of scope that's actually been introduced in the last version of the Chair's text is that the text clarifies that payments from one government to another government under access agreements for fishing would not be considered part of the scope of this agreement. They're not subsidies at all, according to my own understanding. So that footnote clarifies that they don't sit within the scope of this agreement. So there's probably at least one important key decision to take here, and that's whether non-specific fuel subsidies should be included in the scope of this agreement. So the agreement in principle would apply to subsidies per the ASCM definition and would apply to those subsidies that are specific per the definition of specificity in the ASCM. But some members have proposed that in fact fuel subsidies provided horizontally across an economy should also be included in the scope of the agreement because they have potentially environmental impacts as well. One point to make on the definition side is that this is an area where, as far as I can see, really good progress is being made, and it's helping very much to clarify exactly what we're talking about in this agreement. So the definition of what is a vessel, the definition of what is fish, we think, the definition of what is fishing and what are fishing related activities have been based on the FAO's agreement on port state measures. And so those definitions taken from the fisheries context are more or less, it seems to be more or less agreed that these will be the definitions that are used in this agreement, which I think helps to provide useful coherence with how these concepts are treated in fisheries law. Just a very quick point. So there are a couple of proposals which sometimes kind of intrude on the scope discussion. And those are proposals for an exception for subsidies to artisanal fishing and an exception for subsidies provided for disaster relief after a natural or man-made disaster. So those are sometimes discussed in the context of scope. At the moment, they're proposed as exceptions for specific pillars of the negotiation. So we mention them here because sometimes they come into the scope discussion, but at the moment they're proposed as exceptions for specific pillars. So that's scope and definitions in a slide. We're going to move now to the first of the substantive pillars of the negotiations, and that's the idea of prohibiting subsidies to vessels or operators that are found to be engaged in illegal, unreported, or unregulated fishing. I mean, broadly, the idea here is that a member's subsidy obligation is triggered when there is an administrative decision, a determination taken by that member or another member, and that's after any review or appeal, that a vessel was engaged in activity that is considered illegal, unreported, or unregulated in the context in which it takes place. So the trigger of this obligation isn't automatic. It's likely to be subject to some requirements that we're going to discuss next. And one interesting addition in the latest draft of the Chair's text is that this obligation is triggered only by an affirmative determination. This is a word that's just been added. So a determination that IUU fishing did take place. Now, this is in there to respond to a concern that one member's determination of IUU fishing might somehow be cancelled out if another authority decides that that particular circumstance wasn't a case of IUU fishing. My own view is this is not likely to happen. In practice, regulators or courts generally have jurisdiction to interpret their own laws in particular, but if it helps to create comfort with how this rule would work, then it's a potentially useful addition. The text on the table also include a sort of a distinctive, perhaps complementary approach to this determination trigger, and that is that there should be a broad obligation, a sort of due diligence approach, a broad obligation on members to have in place measures to ensure subsidies don't go to IUU fishing. So there are 4 key decisions on the table in this pillar. 4 decisions, I suppose, to think about when you're putting your positions together. The first is which entities' determinations would trigger this subsidy obligation. Members have proposed a number of options, and there now seems, I think, to be some convergence around 3 options: that determinations of IUU fishing by coastal states, by flag states, and by regional fisheries management organizations would trigger the obligation to remove subsidies. There's still some disagreement around whether it's useful to add subsidizing members' determinations or port state determinations to that list. An important point here is that there's specific language in a footnote to clarify that issuing these determinations is a right members have and not an obligation. So in other words, this WTO agreement doesn't oblige governments to make determinations of IUU fishing. They may make them or not, according to their own fisheries legislation. But what this agreement does is that it would oblige members to remove subsidies from vessels or operators that are the subject of those determinations under some conditions. So the second key decision in the design is what due process, what requirements should be required, what due process should be required before a determination triggers a subsidy obligation. And the policy challenge here is that members would like some kind of safeguard that ensures that determinations that are made unfairly by one member don't automatically trigger their obligation to remove subsidies from that vessel or operator. But at the same time, those conditions and requirements can't be so strict that members can simply escape the obligation to remove subsidies. So the latest draft essentially focuses on 3 main elements: that determinations should be based on positive evidence, they should follow due process, and they should do this in accordance with relevant international law. And there's still some disagreement over exactly how these qualifications or requirements should be constructed. Again, an important point here is that there's an additional footnote to clarify that none of these rules affect the validity or enforceability of an IUU determination. So if there are due process requirements, they would apply to the process of how the determination is made, but not to its validity or its enforceability. So a member is free to decide, for example, what activity to focus on its maritime control efforts, what activity justifies sanctions. But the administrative process of arriving at that determination would need to meet some general concept of due process if it is to act as a trigger for another member's subsidy obligation. So that's, I think, a sort of a second point of comfort that's being added in to make sure it's clear how much this agreement extends into members' obligations and fisheries management, how much it doesn't. There's also a discussion about whether members should be required to notify the flag state of a vessel if it's the subject of a determination or at least an investigation, which I understand is quite common practice in maritime law. And also, when we get to the transparency, you'll see there's a suggestion that members should be required to notify to the WTO if they make a determination, which would seem to be a useful way of making sure everyone's on notice that a determination has been made. 2 more key questions in the IUU fishing part. So decision number 3 is essentially whether the agreement should clarify, and if so, how this obligation should be implemented. And there's basically 2 main ideas here. The idea of proportionality, so the possibility of excluding minor violations, is probably the most important because it would involve limiting the scope of determinations that would trigger the subsidy prohibition. So the chair's text currently would allow a subsidizing member to consider the nature, the gravity, or the repetition or the seriousness of an offence before deciding whether in fact to withdraw subsidies from that vessel or operator. This is a substantial degree of flexibility for the subsidizing member, right? There are some limits though that are suggested to limit this flexibility or discretion the subsidizing member has and how it applies this discipline. So there is a footnote which lists a number of serious offences which would always trigger the application of the prohibition. So a subsidising member couldn't avoid removing or withdrawing subsidies if the vessel was caught doing one of these particularly serious things, and there's discussion about whether that list is appropriate or not. And similarly, there's an idea of ensuring that if a member withdraws a subsidy, that should be done for a minimum amount of time. So the amount of time that that the sanction is in place, or another sort of actually quantified minimum amount of time. The last key decision on IUU fishing is if, and if so what, special and differential treatment for developing country members would be appropriate in this context. Now, firstly, there isn't agreement that there should be any special and differential treatment for IUU fishing, but those that have proposed that there should be have essentially suggested two particular ideas. The first is to provide longer transitional periods for developing country members to implement systems in order to apply this obligation. And the second is that developing country members wouldn't be required to withdraw subsidies from essentially small-scale fishing, fishing that's not large-scale. So basically kind of small-scale or commercial fishing that is the subject of a determination that it was involved in unreported or unregulated fishing. So the obligation would always apply if a determination related to actually illegal fishing, the idea is, but if it's a determination that fishing was unreported or unregulated and the vessel or operators engaged in small-scale fishing, that subsidies could continue to be allowed. So that's one of the, and the other important part of that is that this exception would apply for small-scale fishing within the territorial sea. So that's 12 nautical miles from a country's baseline. And will come up, I think, a lot in the next hour or so with this question of whether geographical limitations make sense or not. So those essentially are the four key questions on the table for IUU fishing. I'm conscious of time, so what I might do at this point, in fact, is to pause and ask whether there are... Okay, I'll move on. So perhaps, Eleanor, if you don't mind starting the recording again, thanks. So the next substantive pillar in the negotiations is the idea of prohibiting subsidies to overfished stocks. So these are stocks that from a biomass perspective are already far below where they should be in terms of healthy stock levels. So you'll recall from the first FAO slide that the FAO estimates something like 34% of assessed stocks are currently fished beyond sustainable limits, they're overfished. So this discipline would cover some of them. So those arguably in the most worrisome state. So what's involved here on the overfished stocks discipline? So here, basically, the main approach to the negotiations is focused on one in which subsidies would be prohibited for the fishing of a stock that is overfished, and if one of two other factors are present. So the stock is either not recovering, overfished and not recovering, or overfished and in fact continuously falling. So the level of the stock is still continuously falling. So the rule essentially prohibits subsidies to this fishing in a relatively limited set of circumstances, we think, where there's a decision a stock is in an overfished condition and where the stock is in fact not recovering. And this approach reflects a balance between two different views amongst groups of members. There were some that wanted a very strict prohibition on all subsidies when a stock is overfished, and others that wanted a prohibition only on those subsidies that had a negative effect on overfished stocks. So essentially what this discipline does is that it allows for subsidies to continue if a stock is overfished, but if it is recovering back to a healthy level. And there's an additional layer of flexibility or sort of limitation on the prohibition here as well. And that's that even if those two conditions are present, even if a stock is overfished and it is not recovering, members can continue to provide subsidies if they can demonstrate they have measures in place to ensure the stock will recover in the future. And broadly, I think there are probably two key decisions for negotiators to resolve under this particular prohibition. The first is how to establish when a stock is overfished for the purposes of this discipline. And there are two sort of general options, which of course could also be combined. So some proposals, and you'll see these in two kind of alt versions in the text, some proposals would use objective elements that all WTO members would need to take account of in deciding how to link their subsidy and their fisheries decisions. And some of the options suggest a stock would be considered overfished if its level is so low that fishing has to be reduced to enable it to return to a level at which it could produce maximum sustainable yield, or an alternative target that a government chose. There are also proposals to reference entirely, with more or less discretion or more or less deference, decisions by national authorities or regional fisheries management organisations, if the RFMO's mandate allows them to decide when a stock is overfished. Now, obviously, more deference to national decisions and less objective factors provide greater flexibility to members as to when they can decide a stock is overfished for the purposes of these rules, but obviously arguably can potentially lead to a less effective discipline. So there's a balance to be struck there between deference and some level of objectivity to ensure the purpose of the negotiations is met. The third variable here is what level of scientific information an authority should take into account in making its decision of whether a stock is overfished and subsidies should be stopped. The stricter options would require an authority to base its decision on the best scientific evidence available, full stop. A more flexible option would allow an authority to base its decision only on evidence that that authority itself recognised. And there's a lot of debate currently about how strict or how flexible that scientific evidence requirement should be. The second key decision on overfished stocks is whether, and if so, what special differential treatment would be appropriate and effective for developing country members. Again, there's no agreement that there should be special differential treatment here, but those that have proposed it suggest elements similar to those for IUU fishing. So firstly, the idea that there should be a longer time frame for implementation by developing country members of this obligation, and another which would allow developing country members to keep subsidising the fishing of a stock that is overfished when there isn't a management element in place that's sufficient to ensure its recovery, if that fishing took place within the country's territorial sea. So again, 12 nautical miles from a country's baseline. There are other questions around the overfished stocks concept to be resolved. So what should we do about unassessed stocks? And there's some wording in the final provisions that refer to that. But from our perspective on overfished stocks, these are probably the two key decisions that need to be resolved to finally wrap up this part of the negotiation. And what's interesting, just as a comment on the process, is that the language that we have on IUU fishing, and in particular the language that we have on overfished stocks, has been quite stable for the last at least year, 18 months or so. And that's because I think the facilitators who worked very hard at putting this language together have captured in it more or less what countries would be prepared to accept, and have identified the structure they would be prepared to accept, and have identified in it quite clear binary options that policymakers have to choose from. So, you know, you'll see in the negotiations at this point that much more time is being spent on the institutional issues, and in particular on overcapacity and overfishing, because those were areas of the negotiations that until recently were much less advanced. So much more emphasis is being put on clarifying exactly the options, clarifying what is common ground, and articulating clearly where there isn't common ground and decisions need to be made. So having said that, I'll turn precisely to overcapacity and overfishing, which is the third substantive pillar in the discussions, and arguably the one that is likely to have the most impact on global fishing and fisheries subsidies. And it's probably the one that's, at this point, one of the most complicated areas of the negotiation, and one that's worth spending a little bit of time on. So what are we trying to do here? So the third pillar of the negotiations contains a number of different options for rules on subsidies, all of which are designed to respond to the language in our original mandate, which was to prohibit certain kinds of subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. And the focus of the discussions at the moment is on what are called qualitative rules. So essentially rules that would require some kinds of subsidies to be prohibited in some circumstances. And this is essentially because it appeared at the beginning of last year that all members could agree that there should be some qualitative rules. So this was an area at the very broadest level of some common ground. So that is where work has been focused for the last year or so. There are also proposals on the table, which are reflected currently in placeholders in the chair's text, for quantitative rules. So these are things like capping that would set numerical limits on some kinds of subsidies per member according to different processes, negotiations, formulas, etc. But at the moment, the focus of work is on the qualitative prohibitions, because essentially that's one thing that everyone should agree should be there, while there are differences of opinion over whether quantitative limits are required or not. So the main part of this discipline really in the text is contained in the text in Articles 5.1 and 5.2. So Article 5.1 would prohibit a certain list of subsidies because these are widely considered to be those that are most likely to contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. And again, if you recall, the complicated slide from the OECD modelling gives you a sense of why we're focused in this list on subsidies to construction and modernisation of vessels, so that's capital costs, and subsidies to gear and engines, fuel and ice operating costs. That's sort of the thought behind most of the elements on this list. So this is arguably quite a simple and strict approach to the rule, but the rule is also limited or curtailed importantly by Article 5.2. And Article 5.2 would allow members to provide any of these subsidies on this list if it can demonstrate that it has implemented measures to maintain stocks at sustainable levels. And these measures kind of would be ideally made with reference to concepts like maximum sustainable yield or an alternative reference point. And this combination, so the prohibition is really made up of those two key elements, and this reflects the view of some members that their management systems are sufficient to ensure that even if they provide subsidies, these won't lead to overcapacity and to overfishing. And we have there's a similar ongoing debate in the negotiations with respect to the management element here, and also a similar management question in the overfished stocks discipline. And that's how we should refer to the standards for scientific elements that would support or allow a decision to keep subsidizing. And one question there is whether we should have references to maximum sustainable yield, which is a concept that of course is referenced in UNCLOS, and it's been sort of a guiding principle for a lot of fisheries management for many years. But it's also clear from many members that not all fisheries management systems use MSY as a reference point. So there's language in 5.2 that would allow members to use alternative reference points if that's what their fisheries management system is based on. And the debate at the moment essentially revolves around whether a reference to alternative reference points as a basis for management decisions is sufficiently flexible to allow a wide range of WTO members to avail themselves to use this element of the prohibition to continue providing some subsidies. And the latest version of the chair's text includes language that tries to give members with this concern some comfort. So it explains what some kinds of alternative reference points could be used, including a reference to the level of depletion in a fish stock. And this is a major point of discussion in the negotiations. So when we get to the discussion part, I'd be interested to hear your views as well of whether that provides an additional useful degree of comfort or what an alternative could look like. So key decision one is how should this main discipline, the combination of 5.1 and 5.2, be designed? The second key decision is what rules should apply to subsidies to fishing in areas beyond a member's national jurisdiction. So the chair's text contains, or the chair's draft consolidated text contains, on the basis of proposals made, further ideas for quite targeted rules on subsidies to address some specific policy problems. And the first is this idea of prohibiting subsidies to fishing in areas beyond national jurisdictions. So that's understood to mean areas beyond a coastal state's exclusive economic zone. So that's 200 nautical miles from the baseline. There's two approaches to this areas beyond national jurisdiction idea in the text, which I think are designed to be complementary. The first option focuses on some kinds of subsidies, but in a wide range of geographical areas. So it would prohibit only those subsidies contingent on or focused on distant water fishing, but would cover all of that fishing, whether it took place in the high seas or in another member's exclusive economic zone. So some subsidies with a particular purpose, but in a wide range of geographical areas. The second kind of complementary option to approach this particular problem would cover more subsidies. So it would cover all subsidies to fishing, but in a narrow geographical area. So it would cover all subsidies to fishing. It would cover any subsidy provided to fishing on the high seas, unless that fishing was governed by a regional fisheries management organization. So these are two options to try and tackle the question of subsidies that are focused on increasing capacity and increasing effort in the high seas and in common or shared resources. There's a question here that's sort of coming up a lot about, and I think we put it here because we think it's linked to this concept of distant water fishing, is the question of how to treat what's called the non-recovery of payments made, the non-recovery of the costs of access purchased by one government to another. So you'll recall in the scope discussion, we talked about the fact that it's clear that a payment from one government to another is not a subsidy and it's not considered part of the scope of this agreement. But what could be a subsidy, I would say is a subsidy, is when a government purchases access in another country's waters, provides that access to its fleet without any element of cost recovery. Otherwise, the fleet would have to pay for that itself. So the question is, how do we treat in this agreement the non-recovery of the value of those, the value of that access that's transferred? Excuse me. So that's a question that's ongoing, and one that's coming up quite a lot in the negotiations just in the last few weeks. The second sort of major idea in the question of subsidies to fishing outside a member's waters, which is reflected in the text, is that of prohibiting subsidies to vessels that don't carry the flag of the subsidizing member. So the objective here, essentially, is to ensure that vessels that receive government subsidies from one government are also under at least the flag state jurisdiction of that government. So the subsidizing state has an additional measure of control over the activities of the vessels and operators that it subsidizes. Now this, from a kind of policy coherence perspective, might make sense, but it's worth acknowledging that it's an extremely sensitive point for some members who have what are called open registries. So registries, open registries, which allow vessels that aren't based in their own country to use the flag of that country. So the second kind of, or rather this is the third now, the third key decision in the overcapacity overfishing element of the agreement is this question of, should we include quantitative prohibitions? Should we have quantitative limits as well as qualitative rules about when subsidies should be provided? And there are a number of different options on the table, reflecting different ways that these numerical limits or caps and commitments to reduce subsidies could be set. So some proposals would divide members by their proportion of global fishing, for example, fishing catch or other variables. The basic idea being that those responsible for the largest catch would undertake stricter numerical limits on subsidies, with some exceptions. And those members responsible for a smaller proportion would be subject to less restrictions or no restrictions at all. There's been a lot of debate around how best to structure this part of the agreement if it's included. So for example, one concern that's come up is the question of, if these caps and limits are set through negotiation, is there a way of increasing the transparency by which the limits are set? So some members have proposed a negotiated approach to setting the limits. Others have proposed a formula approach. So it's quite clear from the beginning exactly how much different members will be required to reduce their subsidies once caps are set. So some proposals for the quantitative rules would require different commitments from different members based on their level of development. So explicit sort of bright line distinctions between developed, developing country members and LDCs, and other proposals purposefully don't focus on development status distinctions and divide members up by other criteria. The last key decision on overcapacity and overfishing, at least on the sort of the side of the prohibitions, is should the discipline include a green box of subsidies, a list of subsidies essentially that are exempted from the qualitative or the quantitative rules, or both. And some members argue that some subsidies clearly don't contribute to overcapacity or overfishing, and that a green box listing of allowable subsidies would give their administrations useful certainty about what kinds of support they can provide to their fishing sector. Other members are very wary of including a list of subsidies deemed not to be harmful, arguing that many of these kinds of subsidies can contribute to overcapacity or overfishing if they're poorly designed. So that's an ongoing debate in the negotiations about the structure of the overcapacity and overfishing discipline itself. So getting to what is one of the most sort of politically challenging and also obviously very important questions here, is the question of special and differential treatment. And this is where, honestly, I think that the agreement has got likely to have, where the level of ambition and the level of impact of the agreement is likely to be defined in the balance between the prohibitions and the exceptions in the overcapacity and overfishing pillar. So the Chair's draft consolidated text includes a list of exceptions that follow different approaches. There are flexibilities that would lead to the same level of commitment being taken by all members, but with longer timeframes and with assistance for implementation. Those are probably the least controversial, but it's clear from many developing country members that they would like additional flexibilities on top of these. So there are also proposals reflected in the Chair's text to exclude least developed countries from the basic prohibition in 5.1. There's proposals to exclude subsidies provided by developing country members to fishing in their territorial sea. So that's the 12 nautical miles. And views differ on whether either of those ideas is appropriate or effective. And the third idea in the Chair's text is to allow further flexibilities for developing country members to provide subsidies to fishing within their exclusive economic zone, and if they meet a set of objective criteria. And by our calculations, this set of criteria would essentially allow all developing country members to continue to provide operating and capital cost subsidies to fishing within their EEZ. And the only exception is likely to be China, based on the particular criteria listed, and perhaps a South American country, depending on catch levels per year. So interestingly, in the last version of the Chair's text, this last and potentially very large exception is being described, I think, as a form of transitional mechanism. And so the Chair has included in his text a placeholder for other transitional mechanisms. The idea being, I think, that as members eventually fulfilled some of these criteria, that the exception would eventually cease to apply to them. Now, all of these exceptions, of course, are in addition to the flexibility that's already built into the basic prohibition in the combination of 5.1 and 5.2. So essentially, this would apply if a member could not demonstrate that it had measures in place to ensure a stock was being fished sustainably. These exceptions would apply in addition to that particular circumstance. A fifth key decision, which is also an important one, that's come up a lot in the last few weeks of negotiation, is whether there should be an exception allowed for subsidies to operating and capital costs provided to artisanal fishing. And we've placed it here separate to the special and differential treatment question, because the proposal currently on the table has suggested that there be a limited exception for artisanal fishing with some particular qualifiers taking place in the territorial sea, but one that would apply to all members. So that would be one potential approach to the artisanal fishing question. So at the moment, the base language in the proposal would focus on artisanal fishing, defined with reference to the fact that fishers are low income and resource poor, focusing on activities that are performed on an individual or family basis and within the territorial sea. Now, other members have suggested much broader variations on this, removing the 12 nautical mile geographic limit, for example, or including slightly larger scale fishing or fishing in associations. Now, tomorrow morning's session is going to look at a range of data that we hope will illustrate the potential scope of some of these exceptions. But one point that, if you'll allow me some editorializing at this point, to give you sort of at least our perspective on the special and differential treatment and also the artisanal fishing exception idea. I mean, we're constantly reminded that our original mandate in these negotiations identifies two key policy priorities, particularly for the special and differential treatment element, and in justifying why it is such an integral part of these negotiations, which it is. And that firstly, poverty reduction, so supporting food security and livelihoods, and secondly, broader development priorities, which for many members includes the idea of building larger fleets to exploit international or national fisheries. Now, from our perspective, the key challenge in balancing these objectives is that their relationship is interdynamic, right? We want to preserve essentially achieving the poverty reduction and the development objectives in the long term is going to require some attention to maintaining the status of the resource and maintaining the sustainability of the resource. So, in balancing these objectives, if we allow ongoing subsidization that encourages fishing that depletes stocks, we risk we risk a situation where the achievement of poverty reduction, the achievement of food security and livelihood protection, and the achievement of broader development aims isn't achieved in the long term, simply because we've depleted the resource that achieving those objectives requires. So ensuring that fish stocks are exploited sustainably, I think, is crucial if policymakers want to ensure that the poverty reduction and development priorities in the mandate are achieved in the long term. So that's just a piece of editorializing at this point. I'm going to cover briefly the legal and institutional issues, and then we'll pause for some discussion. But again, if you have questions, comments as you go through, please do put them in the chat box so we can make sure we record them at the end. So there are a range of legal and institutional issues in these negotiations, and these are issues that have in fact been given greater amount of time and attention in the last few months, because, as I was saying at the beginning, they had sort of been left behind in the negotiations for quite a while. So it's good that we can start to see how some of these kind of treaty-making elements of this new agreement might come into shape. So what are some of the key decisions? The first is probably around the question of transparency and notifications. Now, many of you will be aware, Article 25 of the WTO's Agreement on Subsidies currently requires members to notify all of their subsidies as defined in Article 1, all of those subsidies that are specific. Notifications need to include the form of the subsidy, the amount provided, its policy objective. And so the idea here in the Fisheries Subsidies negotiation is whether, on top of those requirements, governments should also be required to provide fisheries-specific information. So, for example, the type of marine fishing activity that receives subsidies, the status of the stocks for which a subsidy is provided, elements that allow other members to see how subsidies specifically to fishing are being provided and what the state of the resource is of which the fishing is subsidized. Two other ideas that have come up in the transparency notification requirement, starting to link back to the substantive disciplines, is the idea that governments might be required to notify their IUU determinations. You'll recall we heard this at the beginning, essentially, which would allow other WTO members to be put on notice that a determination has been made, so that they are aware if they subsidize this vessel, that their obligation may be triggered. And also a proposal to require notification of government-to-government access agreements. And there's been a proposal, I think, quite recently that there should be additional transparency around these access agreements, and in particular the terms of them. An important point I think to make here is that notification is, at least in part, designed to help members monitor each other's compliance with the WTO agreement. So the final content of the notifications is going, or the notification requirements is going to depend on what the content of the disciplines are. A couple of other points. There's a key decision to be made about the legal form of the agreement. It's a real lawyer's question. There are basically two main options under discussion. We could have a standalone agreement incorporated into the WTO treaties under Annex 1 of the Marrakesh Agreement, a bit like the Trade Facilitation Agreement. Or we could have an annex to the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. Now, this was a question that was put to heads of delegation back in September, but views were still divided on which was the appropriate element. And I suspect there were probably two kind of considerations at play there. There's a legal way of looking at it and a political negotiating way of looking at it. From a legal perspective, arguably it might be simpler to establish a standalone agreement and then to draw in parts of the ASCM or other WTO agreements that we might want. But equivalently, on the other hand, some members may want to keep the discussion very closely linked to the ASCM in order to facilitate the reuse of existing concepts that apply to subsidies rules in the WTO. So there's two ways of looking at it. The last point here is it's a relatively small sort of key decision, but worth mentioning, is that there's a question here about exactly what kind of committee should administer this new instrument and what its role and responsibilities should be. And there's already provisions in the text about what the role and responsibilities of a committee to monitor this agreement would be. So that's, I think, an extremely useful step forward and provides a basis from which some of these decisions can be made. There are a number of questions around how the WTO's dispute settlement system would apply to this new agreement, and these are important questions. And in fact, it's interesting to see there's actually quite good progress being made on a lot of these questions and some common ground beginning to emerge. So to move through the questions in the order that a dispute might happen, in a situation where a member challenges another member's fishing subsidy, arguing that it's not consistent with this agreement, if they win, what happens next? There seems to be general agreement, I think, that the basic remedy that applies per the subsidies agreement, that the subsidy must be withdrawn, should apply here too. It's an open question, though, still, whether members would also like to take unilateral action against a subsidy, so along the lines of a countervailing duty, as they can do against existing industrial subsidies, and how this mechanism would work if you don't have trade effects to calculate. So there's a question there about should we have additional unilateral remedies or not. So then sort of in the next step, if you've gone through the panel stage, if the defending member doesn't withdraw its subsidies, the complainant can challenge this non-compliance, as it's called. If they win that part of the dispute, under WTO law, the complainant can take what's called countermeasures, which are designed to encourage the defendant to bring its policy into compliance with the agreement. Now, the ASCM currently allows a panel to authorize a complainant to take appropriate countermeasures, in quotes, which sounds like a usefully flexible phrase, which could also work for a fisheries subsidies agreement, but there's no agreement yet as to whether that's exactly the right approach to take for a fisheries subsidies discipline, or if something new or different should be developed. So moving then kind of from the process back to what a panel would actually look like and how a dispute would be decided, decision 3 is about what's called the standard of review. So members are thinking about how far WTO dispute settlement panels should examine fisheries management decisions, like whether a stock is overfished, that would trigger the situation, that would trigger the subsidy obligations that are the focus of this agreement. So most members, we think, seem to converge on the idea that a panel shouldn't engage in what's called de novo review. So a panel shouldn't go through a fisheries management decision from the very beginning. But also the question is, should a panel provide full deference to a member's decision on whether a stock is overfished or not? And there are very different views on this. And some are reflected, of course, in how much we use objective elements in defining this decision in the agreement, MSY, etc., and how much we refer or how much we provide full deference to national decisions. So that's a sort of a question that's come up as well. I have to say the standard legal approach would be not to specifically clarify a standard of review, but to draft the rules so that the extent of members' obligations was clear. Key decision for a particularly sensitive one from a political standpoint: how, if at all, should this agreement address situations of disputed jurisdiction over maritime areas? And this is obviously a question of the highest political sensitivity for some members. And the Chair's draft consolidated text reflects, we think, two of the main ideas in this discussion, around which there is some comfort, but no agreement yet. And the first is the idea that any decision by a WTO panel or the WTO appellate body would have no implications for territorial disputes outside the context of the WTO, sort of a savings provision. The second element is that panels would be required not to entertain, so not to consider, particular claims in a dispute that would require them to address an issue of delimitation of maritime disputes. So essentially trying to ensure that WTO panels can help to resolve disputes, but not in a way that affects in any way the very sensitive political decisions about our political disagreements about who has jurisdiction over a particular area. So trying to enable disputes to be resolved in the WTO, but without affecting these very sensitive political questions. So that, you will be relieved to find, to hear, more or less brings us to the end of the legal and institutional issues and the overcapacity and overfishing discussion. So one thing that I just wanted to mention before we finish here and move to the discussion is that we will produce a video of this, of course, but we also have videos that walk you through the basic concepts, the basic maritime law concepts and the basic concepts of overfishing and overcapacity. We have videos that explain that on our website if you would find them useful. And the last published assessment that we provided of the state of play, which walks through, as I have here, the main elements in the Chair's text, we published back in July. Now the Chair's, and here are the links, it's available in English and Spanish and French. The Chair's text has obviously evolved slightly since then, but many of the descriptions are still accurate because much of the text has remained more or less stable since then. So with that, I might ask Eleonora to